Let's explore this a little further with John Curtis, one of the UK's most distinguished election experts and professor at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. John, how do you see this? Incumbent parties lose mid-term elections. Mrs Thatcher lost loads of by-elections and went on to win at general elections. Should Boris Johnson be worried?
Yes, because you're right, Mrs Thatcher did lose a number of by-elections, but she never managed to lose as spectacularly as this. The Prime Minister, I'm afraid, who is much closer to the experience that Boris Johnson and the rebuff that Boris Johnson received last night is John Major, who, of course, is a much more hapless precedent. It's the one and only time that the Conservatives had suffered a bigger reverse than this was in the Christchurch by-election of 1993 under John Major. There were a couple of others that were almost as bad as this. Now, John Major didn't go on to win the next general election. He went on to lead his party to defeat. John Major, indeed, also, before that election defeat, went on to face a challenge for the leadership of the party. And in the meantime, he continued to preside over a deeply divided party. So if the Tories want to look for precedents upon which they should be thinking about drawing, it's John Major they should be looking at, not Margaret Thatcher.
Can we drill down a little further into the motives for this voting pattern? Is this, do you think, about frustration with coronavirus, this grimness of the last 18 months or so? Is it about government sleaze on awarding contracts, huge contracts to friends of the Conservative Party, or redecorating Downing Street, Christmas parties while the country was in lockdown? What is it, or a combination of all?
Well, I think undoubtedly the most immediate, the most proximate explanation is the combination of the Owen Paterson affair. And of course, that's the affair that gave rise to this by-election. Mr. Paterson was ruled to have broken the rules on lobbying. The Prime Minister presided over an attempt to try and stop the suspension that had been recommended because of that breach, and then found himself having to do a 180-degree turn and upset both a lot of voters and a lot of MPs along the way. And then, more immediately, just a week ago, that release of a video showing Number 10 aides doing a mock conference in which they laughed nervously when there was mention of a party that was allegedly held a few days before their press conference. And if you compare the Conservative position in the polls now with where it was just 6 weeks ago, before the Owen Paterson affair broke out, the party standing in the national polls is now 6 points adrift of where it was then. In other words, the Conservatives have been losing a point in the polls every week for the last 6 weeks. And that comes on the back of a tendency for the Conservative vote to be declining from the beginning of the autumn. So the Conservatives have seen support fall away in a fairly dramatic, rather quick fashion in the national polls. What this by-election simply tells us is that indeed that is at risk of translating into the actual ballot box. Of course, yes, especially in the circumstances of a by-election, but even for the circumstances of a by-election, this was a very substantial reverse.
John, you make him sound like an electoral dead duck. I mean, can Boris Johnson get back on winning form, or is this the end of the game?
He can, but he's got to avoid making the crucial mistake that lies behind the last 6 weeks. And he probably also is going to have to weather the storm of the coronavirus. So let's take those 2 points. The reason why Boris Johnson's in so much trouble is that he's a Prime Minister who is focused on getting done what he wants to get done and isn't too careful about following the rules on getting there. After all, he was told by the UK Supreme Court very early in his premiership that he'd broken the law in trying to stop Parliament from meeting. But on that occasion, half the electorate at least were behind him because he was pursuing that course of action in order to try to pursue the Brexit that they believed in. The problem that Boris Johnson has found now, as compared with the other arguments about him breaking the rules, is there aren't any voters out there who think that MPs who've broken the rules on lobbying should be rescued by the Prime Minister, and there aren't any voters out there who think that the rules on lockdown are ones for everybody else to follow but not for people in number 10 Downing Street. So given the lack of a noble cause for bending the rules in the eyes of any voters, then Boris Johnson's tendency to, shall we say, to be somewhat economical in his alignment with those rules has come unstuck for him. The second thing, and I think perhaps on a lot of which now his premiership is going to rest, is does the big bet that he has made in the last week, 10 days, that the Omicron variant rise in the pandemic can be dealt with primarily by boosting the booster and not imposing very much in way of restrictions. Is that a bet that's going to work, or is it going to fail? Is he going to find himself indeed having to impose restrictions of a fairly draconian kind, or indeed finding himself with the hospitals overflowing with patients? If either of those two things happen, then it may well be that the path back to electoral popularity for the Prime Minister is strewed with too many barriers.
Professor John Curtis in Glasgow, thank you very much.